The frozen breath of Sergeant Thomas Mitchell hung in the air like a ghostly warning as he peered through the morning mist of December 16th, 1944. Something felt different in the Ardennes forest. The usual sounds of winter creaking, branches, distant artillery practice. The mundane chatter of Allied forces had been replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl beneath layers of wool and canvas. "You hear that, Sarge?" whispered Private Danny Rodriguez, his 19-year-old. Voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the snow-laden pines. Mitchell strained his ears. That was just it, he heard nothing. After months of predictable German defensive positions, this silence was deafening. The 106th Infantry Division had been holding this quiet sector for weeks, supposed rest area for green troops and battle-weary veterans alike. But Mitchell, a veteran of Normandy and St. Vith, knew better than to trust quiet mornings in wartime. At 0530 hours, the silence shattered like crystal against stone. The earth beneath their feet trembled, as if awakened by some primordial force. Thunder rolled across the Ardennes, but there were no storm clouds, only the orange flashes of Germans. Artillery lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireworks. Jesus Christ. Rodriguez scrambled for his rifle as shells began falling around their forward observation post. Where the hell did they come from? Mitchell grabbed his field radio, already knowing the lines would be cut. This wasn't random. Harassment fire. This was the prelude to something massive. The intensity of the bombardment told him everything he needed to know. This was Hitler's last desperate gambit, and they were standing directly in its path. Through the chaos of exploding shells and falling timber, Mitchell caught glimpses of movement in the forest. Shadows that moved with purpose, the glint of steel helmets, the unmistakable silhouette of German panzer tanks emerging from positions that Allied intelligence had sworn were empty. The Wehrmacht had achieved complete tactical surprise, and now American forces were about to pay the price, as reported by war correspondent Ernest Hemingway in his dispatches from the front. The German offensive caught Allied forces completely off guard, with many units overrun in the first hours of the attack. Rodriguez, we need to get word back to headquarters, Mitchell shouted over the din of incoming artillery. But as he turned toward their communication lines, he saw the devastating truth, smoke rising from the direction of their main positions, the orange glow of burning vehicles, and the distinct sound of German voices growing closer. They weren't just under attack, they were cut off, behind enemy lines before the battle had even truly begun. The greatest German offensive since 1940 had just erupted around them, and Sergeant Thomas Mitchell and his small unit were about to become unwilling participants in what historians would later call the Battle of the Bulge. The wolves of war had awakened in the Ardennes, and they were hungry for American blood. Lieutenant Colonel William Hayes of the 4th Armored Division received the fragmentary reports with growing alarm. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape of December 16th, radio communications were sporadic at best, filled with static and panic-stricken voices reporting massive German attacks across a 60-mile front. What had begun as routine morning briefings quickly devolved into desperate pleas for reinforcement. An evacuation? Sir, we're getting reports of enemy armor moving through La Somme Gap, reported Captain James Sullivan, his usually steady voice cracking with tension. The 294th Infantry Regiment is requesting immediate support. They're reporting. Jesus, sir. They're reporting Tiger tanks. Hayes studied the tactical map spread across his field table. Red pins marking known German positions that were suddenly multiplying like a spreading infection. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group West had achieved what Allied intelligence deemed impossible: complete operational surprise across the entire Ardennes sector. The German plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its execution. 3 entire armies of 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, the 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, the 7th Army led by General Erich Brandenberger, had emerged from the winter forests like phantoms made. Flesch, meanwhile, 20 miles northeast of Hayes' position. Sergeant Mitchell and his isolated squad had spent the night evading German patrols while making their way through snow-covered terrain toward what they hoped were friendly lines. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below freezing. Private Rodriguez was showing early signs of frostbite despite their constant movement. "Sarge, I can't feel my feet anymore," Rodriguez whispered as they took shelter in an abandoned Belgian farmhouse. Through the broken windows, you could see German supply columns moving steadily westward. Clear evidence that this wasn't a limited attack, but a full-scale offensive. Mitchell examined their situation with the cold calculation of a professional soldier. They had limited ammunition, no radio contact, and were surrounded by enemy forces advancing toward the Meuse River. Their only advantage was mobility and the element of surprise. The Germans didn't know they were there. "Listen up, men," Mitchell addressed his remaining 5 soldiers. "We're not just trying to survive anymore. We're intelligence assets behind enemy lines. Every German unit we observe, every vehicle we count, every movement we track, that's information that could save American lives." Through the farmhouse windows, they watched as elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich moved past their position. Mitchell made careful notes of unit markings, equipment types, and direction of travel. This information, if they could somehow transmit it, would be invaluable to Allied commanders trying to understand the scope of the German offensive. As night fell on December 16th, the true magnitude of Operation Watch on the Rhine became apparent. German forces had penetrated deep into American lines, creating a bulge in Allied positions that stretched from Monchaux in the north to Echternach in the south. Entire American units had been overrun or bypassed, creating pockets of resistance. Behind rapidly advancing German spearheads, the battle that would define the final months of the war in Europe had begun. And for soldiers like Sergeant Mitchell, survival would depend not just on military skill, but on the ability to adapt, improvise, and maintain hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Major General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division received the emergency deployment orders at Fort Campbell on December 17th. Just 24 hours after the German offensive began, the message was brief, but urgent. Proceed immediately to Bastogne, Belgium, and hold at all costs. The strategic crossroads town had become the linchpin of American resistance in the southern sector of what was rapidly becoming known as the Battle of the Bulge. The paratroopers of the Screaming Eagles loaded onto trucks and began their hasty movement toward Belgium, many still wearing summer uniforms and lacking proper winter equipment. They had no idea they were racing toward what would become one of the most famous defensive actions in American military history, 300 miles away. Sergeant Mitchell's reconnaissance team had spent 48 hours observing German movements, while slowly working their way toward American lines. What they witnessed painted a picture of German success that would have terrified Allied commanders. Panzer columns stretched for miles, infantry divisions moved with confidence and purpose, and supply trains flowed steadily westward. "My God," Sarge whispered Corporal Eddie Kowalski, a Chicago native who had joined the squad just weeks before the offensive. "There must be 20,000 Germans moving through this sector alone." Mitchell nodded grimly as he made detailed notes in his field journal. The German offensive was far more extensive than Allied intelligence had predicted. What had initially been reported as a limited counterattack was clearly a full-scale attempt to reach the English Channel and split Allied forces in two. According to contemporary reports from Stars and Stripes newspaper, the scale of German preparation had been unprecedented, with entire divisions moved into attack positions under cover of radio silence and winter weather. On December 18th, as German forces approached the outskirts of Bastogne, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division established roadblocks throughout the region. It was at one of these checkpoints that Mitchell's team encountered their first direct confrontation with enemy forces. They had been moving through a pine forest at dawn when they stumbled upon a German strongpoint overlooking the main road to Bastogne. 6 Wehrmacht soldiers were manning a machine gun position, unaware that American troops were nearby. Mitchell faced a critical decision: attempt to bypass the position or eliminate it to protect other American forces who might use this route. Firefight lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Mitchell's squad used their superior knowledge of local terrain to outflank the German position, but not without cost. Private Rodriguez took a bullet in the shoulder, and they're precious. Ammunition reserves were significantly depleted. We can't keep this up much longer, Mitchell told his men as they treated Rodriguez's wound with their dwindling medical supplies. But every German position we eliminate is one less obstacle for our boys trying to reach Bastogne. Unknown to Mitchell, his small actions were part of a larger pattern of American resistance that was beginning to slow the German advance. Scattered units, bypassed strong points, and isolated soldiers were conducting an improvised but effective delaying action that was buying precious time for American reinforcements to reach critical positions. As December 18th drew to a close, German forces had advanced further than their most optimistic projections suggested possible. Yet the seeds of their ultimate failure were already being sown by the courage and determination of soldiers like Sergeant Mitchell and his small band of Americans fighting behind enemy lines. General George Patton received his orders from Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower on December 19th, disengaged the Third Army from its offensive operations in the Saar, and pivot 90 degrees north to relieve American forces trapped in the Ardennes. It was a maneuver that military historians would later describe as one of the most impressive displays of operational flexibility in modern warfare. Gentlemen, Patton addressed his staff officers at his headquarters in Nancy, France, we're going to make a sharp turn and drive like hell toward Bastogne. The Krauts have stuck their neck out, and we're going to chop it off. The Third Armies. Movement would require precise coordination of 4 divisions across difficult terrain and winter conditions. But Patton's confidence was infectious. Within hours, tank columns and mechanized infantry were beginning their race northward through the snow-covered countryside of Luxembourg. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mitchell's isolated squad had discovered something that would prove crucial to the overall battle. German fuel shortages were already becoming critical. As they observed enemy movements from concealed positions, they noticed German vehicles being abandoned when they ran out of gasoline, and supply columns were increasingly vulnerable to interdiction. Look at that, Mitchell pointed out to Corporal Kowalski as they watched a German supply convoy halt on the road below their observation point. Third truck in line there siphoning fuel from disabled vehicles. That tells me everything I need to know about their logistics situation. Private Rodriguez, despite his wounded shoulder, had proven invaluable as the squad's designated observer. His sharp eyes had identified numerous German units and their directions of movement. Information that Mitchell carefully recorded for eventual transmission to American intelligence. On December 20th, German forces reached the high water mark of their offensive. Panzer spearheads of the 2nd Panzer Division advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinan, the closest they would come to their objective of reaching Antwerp and splitting Allied forces. But the offensive was already showing signs of strain. The siege of Bastogne had become a symbol of American resistance that resonated far beyond its tactical importance. Major General McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to German surrender demands on December 22nd would become legendary. But the reality facing the encircled garrison was increasingly desperate. Mitchell's squad, now operating in their 5th day behind enemy lines, made a decision that would change their mission entirely. While observing German positions around Bastogne, they discovered a gap in enemy lines that could potentially allow supplies to reach the besieged garrison. "We're not just observers anymore," Mitchell told his men during a brief rest in an abandoned church. "We're going to guide supply runs through that gap. It's dangerous as hell, but those boys in Bastogne need everything they can get." Was audacious. Use their detailed knowledge of German positions to guide small supply convoys through enemy lines during hours of darkness. It would require precise timing, intimate knowledge of patrol schedules, and more than a little luck. As December 22nd dawned clear and cold, weather conditions finally began favoring Allied forces. The skies cleared for the first time since the offensive began, allowing Allied air power to enter the battle in force. But for soldiers on the ground, like Mitchell's squad, the fight remained intensely personal and immediate. The noose around Bastogne was tightening, but American determination was proving stronger than German logistics. The question was whether relief forces could arrive before the garrison's ammunition and medical supplies were completely exhausted. December 23rd, 1944, dawned with crystal-clear skies over the Ardennes battlefield. First truly clear weather since the German offensive began. For the first time in a week, Allied air power could fully engage the enemy. The roar of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs filled the winter air as hundreds of fighter bombers began systematic attacks on German supply lines, tank columns, and troop concentrations. Colonel Bruce Clark of Combat Command B, 7th Armored Division watched from his command post near St. Vith as American aircraft swarmed over German positions like angry hornets. "Thank God for clear weather," he muttered to his operations officer. "Now we can start evening the odds." The German offensive, which had achieved such spectacular initial success through surprise and weather cover, suddenly found itself exposed to devastating air attacks. Fuel shortages, already critical, became catastrophic as Allied fighters destroyed supply convoys faster than German logistics could replace them. Sergeant Mitchell's squad witnessed this transformation firsthand from their concealed positions behind enemy lines. German columns that had moved with confidence and purpose just days earlier now scattered for cover at the first sound of aircraft engines. The initiative was clearly shifting to Allied forces. "Look at them run," observed Private Rodriguez, his wounded shoulder now properly bandaged with supplies taken from a German first aid station. "Yesterday they owned these roads. Today they're scared of their own shadows." According to war correspondent Ernie Pyle's dispatches from the front, the change in German behavior was dramatic and immediate once Allied air power entered the battle in force. Mitchell made a crucial decision on December 23rd that would impact the final outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, using captured German radio equipment. His squad began transmitting false movement orders to enemy units, creating confusion and misdirecting German forces away from critical objectives. "We're not just observing anymore," Mitchell explained to his men. "We're actively disrupting their communications and coordination. Every German unit we can confuse or misdirect is one less problem for our advancing forces." The psychological impact of these deception operations was significant. German commanders, already struggling with fuel shortages and air attacks, now found their communications compromised and their unit movements confused. The fog of war was thickening around German forces just as it was clearing for Allied commanders. On December 24th, General Patton's Third Army launched its relief offensive toward Bastogne with characteristic aggressiveness. The 4th Armored Division, spearheaded by Combat Command Reserve under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, began its final push through German defensive positions south of the besieged town. Mitchell's squad played a direct role in this offensive by guiding elements of the 4th Armored Division through gaps in German lines that they had identified during their week-long reconnaissance mission. Their intimate knowledge of enemy positions and patrol schedules proved invaluable to advancing American forces. There, Mitchell pointed through the pre-dawn darkness of December 25th, Christmas morning, German strong point at the crossroads, but they change guard at 0400 hours. That gives us a 15-minute window to get your tanks through. Captain Robert Smith of the 4th Armored Division looked at the sergeant with newfound respect. "How long have you boys been behind their lines?"
9 days, sir.
"Long enough to know every German in this sector by his first name?"
"It's Christmas."
Day progressed. The sound of tank engines and artillery grew steadily closer to Bastogne. The siege was nearing its end, but the cost had been enormous on both sides. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over, but the tide had clearly turned in favor of Allied forces. The afternoon of December 26, 1944, would be forever etched in the memory of every American soldier who experienced the relief of Bastogne. At exactly 4:45 p.m., elements of the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve broke through German lines and established contact with the besieged 101st Airborne Division. Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion had the honor of being the first relief force commander to enter Bastogne's perimeter. "How are you doing?" he called out to the first paratroopers he encountered. The response was classic airborne spirit. "We're doing fine. We've been expecting you." Sergeant Mitchell's squad played a crucial role in guiding relief forces through the final German defensive positions. Their 9 days behind enemy lines had provided them with unparalleled intelligence about German strongpoints, patrol schedules, and defensive preparations. This knowledge proved invaluable to advancing American armor. "Without your reconnaissance," Captain Smith told Mitchell as American tanks rolled into Bastogne, "we would have lost at least another day fighting through positions we didn't know existed. You boys saved a lot of American lives." The relief of Bastogne marked a turning point not just tactically but psychologically. German forces, which had advanced with such confidence in the early days of the offensive, now found themselves increasingly on the defensive. Fuel shortages, constant air attacks, and stiffening American resistance had transformed their lightning offensive into a grinding battle of attrition. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, observing the deteriorating situation from his headquarters, made a prescient assessment that would prove accurate. The offensive has failed. We lack the resources to sustain operations at this intensity, and American resistance is stronger than anticipated. Private Rodriguez, despite his wounded shoulder, had kept meticulous records of German unit movements and equipment observed during their time behind enemy lines. This intelligence, when finally transmitted to Allied headquarters, provided crucial insights into German order of battle and logistical capabilities. "You've given us the most comprehensive intelligence assessment we've received from any source," Colonel James Patterson of the 12th Army Group Intelligence Section told Mitchell's squad during their debriefing. "Your observations confirm our estimates of German weakness and provide specific targeting information for air operations." The German offensive, which had initially achieved tactical surprise and significant territorial gains, was now clearly failing in its strategic objectives. Hitler's gamble to split Allied forces and recapture Antwerp had cost the Wehrmacht its last strategic reserves, equipment that would be desperately needed for defending German territory in the coming months. On December 28th, German forces began limited withdrawals from their most advanced positions. The bulge that had given the battle its popular name was beginning to contract. As German commanders recognized the impossibility of sustaining their offensive operations, as reported in contemporary military dispatches, the German withdrawal was conducted with typical Wehrmacht professionalism. But the damage to German military capability was irreversible. Mitchell's squad, after 10 days behind enemy lines, was finally evacuated to rear areas for rest and medical treatment. Their contribution to the battle would remain largely unrecognized in official histories, but their impact was significant. Small unit actions like theirs, multiplied across the entire Ardennes battlefield, had played a crucial role in blunting the German offensive. "We did our job," Mitchell reflected as they boarded trucks bound for field hospitals and replacement depots. "Every German we confused, every position we reported, every convoy we misdirected it, all added up to something bigger than any of us realized. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. January 7th, 1940, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as German forces completed their withdrawal to positions east of the Iwo River. What had begun as Hitler's last desperate gamble to change the course of the war in Europe had ended in decisive defeat for the Wehrmacht, costing Germany its final strategic reserves and hastening the end of the Third Reich. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, surveyed the battlefield from his headquarters in Luxembourg City with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The victory had been decisive, but costly. American casualties exceeded 19,000 killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or missing, yet the German losses were even more catastrophic: over 100,000 casualties and the destruction of equipment that could never be replaced. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell stood in the hospital ward at Liege, Belgium, watching Private Rodriguez receive treatment for frostbite injuries sustained during their 10 days behind enemy lines. The young soldier from Chicago would recover fully, but like thousands of other American soldiers, he would carry the physical and psychological scars of the Ardennes campaign for the rest of his life. "You think it was worth it, Sarge?" Rodriguez asked, as medical personnel examined his frostbitten feet. "All those days in the cold, watching Germans, dodging patrols?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. their small reconnaissance mission, had contributed to the larger intelligence picture that helped Allied commanders understand German capabilities and intentions. Their radio deception operations had confused enemy units at critical moments. Their guidance of relief forces had saved American lives and accelerated the relief of Bastogne. Every piece of intelligence we gathered, every German we confused, every position we reported it all mattered, Mitchell replied. Maybe not in ways that will make the history books, but it mattered to the boys who made it home because of what we did. The strategic implications of the German defeat in the Ardennes were profound. Hitler's offensive had consumed the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves, equipment, and personnel that were desperately needed for defending German territory against Soviet forces advancing from the east. The failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine had effectively sealed Germany's fate. Colonel James Patterson, the intelligence officer who had debriefed Mitchell's squad, included their observations in his final assessment of the battle. Small unit reconnaissance operations conducted behind enemy lines provided crucial intelligence that contributed significantly to the successful defense of key positions and the eventual defeat of German offensive operations. The Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated both the continued capability of German forces to conduct major offensive operations and their ultimate inability to sustain such operations against superior Allied resources and determination. The Bulge had been eliminated, but at enormous cost to both sides. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, Allied forces prepared for their final offensive into Germany itself. The lessons learned in the Ardennes and the importance of small unit leadership, the value of tactical intelligence, and the decisive impact of logistics and air power would guide Allied operations in the final months of the war. Sergeant Mitchell returned to his unit in February, promoted to staff sergeant, and awarded the Bronze Star for his actions behind enemy lines. He would participate in the crossing of the Rhine and the final advance into Germany. But the 10 days his squad spent behind enemy lines in the frozen forests of the Ardennes would remain the defining experience of his military service. The Battle of the Bulge had been won not just by grand strategy and overwhelming resources, but by the courage and determination of individual soldiers who refused to surrender when surrounded, who continued fighting when cut off from support, and who found ways to turn desperate circumstances into opportunities for victory. Behind enemy lines in the Ardennes, ordinary American soldiers had proven that the outcome of great battles often depends on the actions of small units conducting missions that history will barely remember, but which make victory possible for those who follow. Their story deserves to be told, remembered, and honored as part of the larger narrative of American triumph in the Second World War.